Welcome to the Bright Solid Bite-sized webinar on securing your AWS environment with controls. My name is Jon Gasparini. I'm the CTO at Bright Solid. And over the last 8 years, I've helped organizations across the UK, Europe, and North America safely adopt public cloud services. My goal over the next 30 minutes is to share some of that experience with all of you and demonstrate why the implementation of controls at the outset of your cloud adoption journey is key. Through an example, I'll look to bring a control to life, describe how you would approach the technical implementation of that control, show how that can help you align with wider industry standards and regulations, touch on some of the business benefits of the overall approach, and then look to finish by describing how Bright Solid can help before we open for questions. So if we're all good with that, let's continue. So I'd hope that most of you would agree that cloud has become the new norm. Organizations are looking to adopt cloud services based on a range of drivers. This slide illustrates the 4 that I see most often through the conversations that I have with customers. Today's webinar is not about getting into any of these drivers in any detail. But what I wanted to say is that the public cloud providers provide a huge range of services and features to help organizations deliver on these drivers. And in the right hands, organizations can achieve great things. However, in inexperienced hands, these features and services can put the organization's data and systems at risk. Through the rest of this webinar, I aim to describe how organizations can help mitigate that risk through controls. So what do you need to know? The first thing you need to know is that the cloud providers operate on the basis of shared responsibility. They talk about a shared responsibility model, and they are very, very clear on their own responsibilities when it comes to physical data centers and the hardware storage and network infrastructure that they host within those data centers, and some of the software services they provide on top of that. That could be the hypervisor for infrastructure as a service. It could be the database engine for a database as a service offering. It could be machine learning, data analytics, messaging services, depending on the services that you're consuming to deliver against your individual drivers. And as part of that, the public cloud providers can evidence, how they're meeting their regulatory requirements or how they're meeting various international standards. And you can request evidence of that, whether it's in relation to ISO 27001, PCI, it could be HIPAA, or other. But they're very, very clear on where their line stops and where the customer responsibility starts. And to bring that to life through an example, if you're a customer running a virtual machine on a cloud provider's platform, the cloud provider is responsible up to and including the hypervisor. The operating system running in that virtual machine is the responsibility of the customer. So what does that mean? It means as a customer, you are responsible for ensuring the latest critical and security patches are applied to that operating system on a regular basis to protect against known vulnerabilities. You're responsible for ensuring the virtual machine is backed up and you're able to recover that virtual machine in the event of a failure. Proactive performance monitoring is another responsibility. All the way through to the firewall rules that control access to that virtual machine. It could be running a web server and you're allowing access in from your customers to view, browse content. It could be the firewall rules that allow your system administrators to get access to the virtual machine to carry out routine maintenance tasks. Again, that's down to you as the customer. So as a customer, you are responsible for implementing the right mix of security and compliance controls to protect your data and systems in the cloud. But a good news though is that the public cloud providers do want to help you achieve that, and they provide a range of services and features that help make that easier. But the configuration of these services and features is down to you as the customer. In the right hands, you can deploy and deliver secure cloud-based services. However, in the wrong hands, your data and systems can be easily compromised. And it's easy, unfortunately, for systems and data to be compromised. This is just one example. This is a a UK care home operator based in England. And this example dates from February of this year, so relatively recent. They were using the object storage service from one of the public cloud providers to store files. And some of these files included sensitive and highly confidential patient information. However, when they configured the object storage service, they enabled the feature to make it publicly accessible. So what does that mean? It just means that anyone that knew the domain name for the object storage location could pop that into their web browser and view or download all of that information. Anyone on this call could have done that. If you knew the domain name, you could put it into your browser, view and download all of that information. So for this organisation, front page of the register back in February of this year, they've probably had a lot of attention from the ICO, and there's a high likelihood of a fine or penalty of some sort shortly as well. Looking back at recent years, there are other organisations that have unfortunately also got this wrong. They are the exception, though. A lot of organisations do get it right. So what can you do to get this right? For me, it's about considering the implementation of strong controls at the outset of your cloud adoption journey. These controls form part of an overall control framework, and within that framework, you want to look at a number of control areas. I've got some examples on this slide, and those control areas include technical controls, but they're also balanced with non-technical controls as well. And I'm going to pick on a couple of examples. If you look at identity and access management, you're going to want to control who has access to the management plane on that cloud provider platform. You probably want to implement a control that enforces a password policy, strong and complex passwords, controlling reuse. You may want to implement a control that enforces multi-factor authentication, or the use of a single sign-on provider if you use one today already. You probably also want to control privileged and non-privileged access within that cloud platform as well. If I then pick on data security, if only this care home provider did the same thing, you probably want to, by default, prevent your storage from being publicly accessible, and ideally also encrypted at rest, so it's more difficult to read if it was compromised in any way. However, you also want to think about exceptions. I may well have stored data that I want to be publicly accessible. It may be image content that supports the delivery of my website. So how do I manage exceptions to controls as well? And then finally, around the technical controls, you want to think about audit logging and monitoring. Who's doing what, where and when in my environment? And how do I detect when someone's doing something they shouldn't? Raise an alert or take action, but also ensure that I've got information available should there be a security incident. It can help support any forensic investigative work that I need to do at some point in the future. So that's some examples of technical controls. When you start to look at the non-technical controls, simple things like contract management, it's very easy for anyone to go and sign up to a public cloud provider using their online terms and conditions just for the credit card. But are those terms and conditions enough to satisfy your organisation's requirements? And I know the UK is leaving the EU, but if you think of GDPR, how do I ensure that I'm protected? The cloud providers are US-based organisations, typically. But they do offer a data protection agreement as part of a contract that helps you meet your GDPR obligations. If you're a retail bank in the UK, they offer a financial services addendum that allows you to comply with the Financial Conduct Authority's cloud guidelines around cloud outsourcing. So again, have you got the right contract framework in place? You also then look at governance and oversight. A control framework isn't just a one-off exercise. You need to regularly assess that your controls remain effective, and you may need to adjust or add controls to respond to new threat vectors or emerging risks that you identify through your risk management framework as a business as well. So these are some examples of some of the controls and control areas that you need to possibly think about as part of your cloud adoption journey. So now I want to kind of drill down to another level of detail, and I'm going to focus on data security and start to build out a data security control. But before I do that, what do I mean by a control? So for me, a control provides reasonable assurance that material risks or errors will ideally be prevented or detected in a timely manner. By prevented, I mean the system will stop someone from not complying with that control, or will take automatic action to bring that event back into compliance. In some cases, I can't do that, and I need to implement a detective control, and that detective control will typically notify a group of individuals, and then you're relying on that group of individuals to then take some investigative and then corrective action to bring that event back into compliance. So we're going to work through an example, and the example this morning is around the encryption of data at rest. But before we define the control, let's think about the risk. If I put all of my data into the public cloud platform in clear text, then anyone that's got access to, say, the management plane of that platform, that could be my administrators, engineers, developers, it could be data scientists, they can view that data. That could be confidential patient data, credit card numbers, bank account details, employee data. I probably don't want that to happen. And because they can view that data and understand that data, it becomes easier for them to modify and manipulate that data, or look to take that data outside of the organisation to exfiltrate that data and perhaps sell it on or use it for their own personal gain. So most organisations would want to try and mitigate or prevent that risk from taking place. The first step would be to define a control statement. And here's an example control statement from our own Right Solid Control framework. So I want the ability to encrypt all data at rest to be available. So the cloud platform that I use must provide the ability to encrypt data at rest. And I want it to be used at all times. So I want my developers to be encrypting data at all times. To encrypt data, I need to use encryption keys. So I need to define a key management policy, which will define how I create keys, where the keys are stored securely, who can manage them, who can use them, how they're rotated. And I want that policy enforced across all cloud platforms. So that's my control statement. Once I've got to that point, I then need to think about how am I going to technically implement that control? How am I going to implement it in a way that ensures my developers are always encrypting the data that I'm putting in that cloud platform? And whether I'm going to take a preventative approach, so actually stop them from using unencrypted storage, or whether I'm going to take a detective approach, actually notify someone so they can then come in and fix it later. For me, that implementation approach is all about developing a set of guardrails, and the guardrails are there to keep developers safe. And if I focus on the picture on the right-hand side, then the architects and engineers designed the bridge, and this bridge allows me to kind of cross the river. There was a straight path right down the middle, a frictionless journey from one side of the river to the other. But when they risk-assessed the design, they recognised there was a risk of me falling off either side of the bridge on the way across and injuring myself. So they built these guardrails to keep me safe as I kind of crossed the bridge. The same is true when it comes to public cloud. You want to provide a frictionless path for your developers to develop new innovative cloud-based services, but you also want the guardrails in place to stop these developers from injuring your organisation or your customer. So what do the guardrails look like? And we're going to build on our example. So we've got our control statement from earlier. We want the ability for data to be encrypted at rest. It's used at all times, and we've got a key management policy that's defined and enforced across all cloud platforms. My guardrail to implement that control is going to comprise of three components. The first, and I talked about this at the beginning, the cloud providers provide services to make this easier. And in this case, I'm going to use two services from AWS. I'm going to use the key management service. That allows me to securely create and store encryption keys, control who can manage those keys, control who can use the keys to encrypt and decrypt data, and I can apply a rotation policy as well. The second service I'm going to use is the AWS Access Identity and Access Management service, and I'm going to define a policy, and that policy is going to control who can use the key management service. I want to restrict those that can create keys, and in particular, delete encryption keys. If you delete the encryption key, you're on the risk of not being able to get your data back. So I want to control that quite tightly. So that's the first step in the guardrail. The second step for me is I want to create an infrastructure as a code pattern. I want to make it really easy for my developers to do the right thing. So this code pattern is a snippet of source code that would launch a virtual machine with all of the encrypted storage, all of the storage encrypted at rest. And I can allow those developers to then use that code snippet as part of their overall code base for developing and delivering a new cloud-based service. If I just stopped here, I'm relying on trust. I'm trusting that my developers will use that code pattern that I've given them, they will always encrypt data at rest. But I know from my experience, when developers come up against problems they've not solved before, they kind of default to Google. They'll go and do a bit of a search. So someone's probably solved this problem before. They might find a code artifact on GitHub they can reuse. There might be a code artifact from one of the cloud providers they can use and adapt as well. And there's a high risk that that code artifact doesn't encrypt storage by default. So those developers could launch virtual machines that don't have encrypted storage, therefore not complying with the control. So I'm not going to rely on trust. I want to do more. And this is the third leg of my guardrail. I'm going to introduce a cloud compliance engine. And within that cloud compliance engine, I can define a rule that's triggered when a virtual machine is launched. And that rule will inspect that virtual machine. And if the storage is not encrypted, it will automatically terminate that virtual machine. I've got a preventative control. I'm taking automatic action to terminate the virtual machine because the data and the storage isn't encrypted at rest. I'll also automatically notify the developer that that has happened. So hopefully they then go and correct the mistake in their code, run their code a second time, and the virtual machine launches successfully. The other advantage of taking an approach based on a compliance engine is I can provide a near real-time view of my control effectiveness to my security and perhaps my audit teams as well. So they can start to self-serve insight into control effectiveness across my public cloud environment. This approach also holds true for the other types of controls that you might want to consider implementing in your public cloud environment as well. One of the other benefits of this approach is you can start to enable and evidence compliance with international standards and regulations. The table on the slide, this is an extract from the Bright Solid Cloud Control Framework. The control area is data security. You can see the control description matches that description we've used in the last couple of slides, the risks we talked about earlier, and the guardrails. You'll recognize the key management service, identity and access management, and infrastructure as a code. We use Terraform at Bright Solid. It's the infrastructure provisioning language of choice for us. There are other choices for organizations out there as well. The one you won't recognize maybe is Cloud Foundations. Cloud Foundations is a Bright Solid product, which includes a cloud compliance engine, and I'll touch on that in a couple of slides' time. But what we can then do is start to demonstrate how that control matches and meets the requirements of various standards and regulations. So in our control framework, we show how we meet the various annexes in the ISO 27001 Information Security Management accreditation, the Centre for Internet Security guidelines. If you're storing and processing credit card data, the payment card industry standard. If you're a UK public sector organisation, how we meet the National Cyber Security Centre's cloud security principles. And then finally, GDPR. But you could extend it to include others. It could be the Financial Services 16/5 guidelines if you're a retail bank, for example, in the UK. It can be easily extended. Overall, if you kind of build on this approach, and certainly in my experience, you can start to build real business confidence that your organisation is doing the right thing in protecting systems and data as part of your adoption of cloud services. I've demonstrated how you can evidence you're meeting your regulatory and compliance requirements in the last slide. You will reduce the risk of compromise. That's going to hopefully reduce security incidents. It's going to reduce the risk of reputational damage. It's going to reduce the risk of any potential fines or penalties that come with a compromise event. As an organisation as well, you can reduce the overhead of internal and external audit. With a compliance engine, you can allow these teams to self-serve. And certainly in my experience, internal audit teams struggle to get through the whole audit agenda in a year. They typically don't have enough resource. The technical teams they need to perform those audits are normally up to their eyes in BAU or project work. So it always develops a level of unhealthy tension. By enabling self-serve, these teams can get access to that information much easier without the same level of effort as before. The other advantage for me is you start to broaden knowledge and awareness around controls and compliance. It's not just down to the security team or the risk team anymore. Your developers need to understand this to develop new applications at the outset. They need to work within the control framework, within the guardrails that you've implemented. The benefit here is they're implementing that early in the life cycle. So no longer do you get the penetration test or the security audit at the end of the project that throws up a whole load of non-conformance and a whole load of extra rework, or worst case, because you've got a deadline to meet, means you're taking a new service into production with some risks you'd rather not exist. You're catching those a lot earlier, you're preventing them a lot earlier. There's a kind of wider awareness, which is great for any organisation. The combination of these things actually then allows the organisation to have the confidence to really accelerate the development and delivery of new cloud-based services to kind of deliver on the drivers that I kind of touched on at the beginning of the webinar. From a Bright Solid point of view, we recognise this is complex for most organisations. When you look at the development of cloud-based services generally, there's not enough skill in the market today to satisfy demand. When you go and combine that with knowledge of controls and compliance and building cloud-based services, that pool of skills and expertise is significantly smaller. And that presents a challenge for most organisations. We recognise that challenge at Bright Solid, and we're looking to help our customers and help our customers accelerate the development of cloud-based services. And today we can do that in 3 ways. We've developed a cloud control framework. So we've defined 17 controls, similar to the example that I showed you earlier. Those controls align to a range of industry standards, ISO 27001, Centre for Internet Security, Payment Card Industry, National Cybersecurity Cloud Security Principles, and GDPR. We've also got a product called Cloud Foundations. It's one of our managed service offerings. We provide out of the box AWS landing zone with a foundational level of controls, including the compliance engine that I talked about earlier, to really allow organizations to accelerate the development of new services, knowing that they've got a good level of compliance and control around that environment. And then finally, through our professional services offerings, we can help customers with, say, a rapid assessment of an existing cloud environment against the Bright Solid Cloud Control Framework, as well as an industry standard benchmark, all the way through to helping customers with the bespoke implementation of specific controls that they may need to meet specific regulations or address specific risks that they've identified within their business. So we can help organizations in a number of ways tackle this challenge and give them the confidence that they can kind of build secure and safe cloud-based services. So as we come to the end of the webinar, if you want to find out more, how do you go about that? I would say, feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to kind of cover any questions. If you're an existing Bright Solid customer, reach out to your account manager. But what we'll also be doing is we will be sharing a recording of the webinar. So look out for an email in the coming days that will be available on our YouTube channel. But we're also offering a time-limited complimentary assessment and kind of dive into maybe your existing cloud environment to help you understand your security and compliance profile. Again, if that's something of interest, the link to the registration forms on the slide you can see, fill in the form, and again, we'll be back in touch with you to kind of follow up. So that brings me to the end of the webinar and the end of the content I was planning to share. Again, I want to thank everyone for the time, and I'm happy to open up for any questions.